Let's talk about some of the sources of shame. Like, where does this tend to develop in people's lives?
Well, I think when I was a little kid, I remember the church lady saying, "Shame on you." You know, that old that old adage, or they used to say that as a motivator. To try to help people move forward. And I heard one person use the phrase "shame off you," as an antidote to that.
Yeah.
But it could happen many times just as a little kid in our family of origin, and how those family systems, how safe they are, how much they focus on growth, not necessarily perfection, and a sense of like, as a kid, how open were you when you made a mistake? You could go to mom and dad. They were the safest people. They provided a framework for you, or school, or siblings, or whatever it may be. I think there can be just a lot of traumatic things that happen in life that somehow create fear in us, where we don't feel like it's socially or culturally acceptable to be open about something. Mm-hmm. And that's where, for me, there were so many wonderful aspects about my faith upbringing that I'm thankful for.
Oh, yeah.
But it wasn't perfect. So many great things about my family of origin, but it wasn't perfect. And my kids are going to say the same thing about me, you know. But I think just trying to be as healthy, or move toward a healthy place as we can as individuals, as families.
Yeah.
But I think many times it happens at a young age, where we don't feel safe. And for whatever reason, the culture doesn't make it a safe place to move toward healing. Family, individuals, even religious cultures for leaders.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, surely as a parent, I have made my sons feel shame, but I've also seen moments where he, like specifically our almost 7-year-old, is at the point where he does something wrong and he runs away in shame. He feels it. He, senses that. And I think, it's part of the fall, I think, in some aspects. But it goes back to that belief that I'm not good enough, and I'm now dirty and unlovable. And it's interesting too, what's playing out is the human condition of shame, is my son does something that, is wrong and we need to address it. But there's embarrassment that's also tied with that, and then running away from relationship. I want to be away. I don't want other people to see it. And there are times too, we go into his room like, what's going on? Like, talk to us about what's happening. It's like, no, I don't want, it's like shoving people away. And so I think in some ways it can develop and it's not like it's Amy and I's fault that Brady has felt shame. I think that there's some of that.
Each kid can respond differently.
Yeah, but I also think that some of that stuff can reinforce it.
Sure.
Like, you have something, you make a bad decision, and then, I remember, and specifically with shame tied to sexuality, that story I've told of asking my mom what the F word meant, and her reaction communicated to me what I interpreted was, it's not okay to talk about this. You should be ashamed about that, asking that question. Right. And so shame almost puts this like identity statement over even themes in life, not just me, but this is something we should be ashamed about.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing how early in life those patterns can develop. In fact, brain research would suggest that some of these patterns of shame do begin before we have conscious memory of where it came from. And it's funny to me, like I can see it happening with my dog, because we have had a dog now for 3 years, and early on you, in a sense, shame your dog if it poops in the house, eats your furniture, like bad dog, and Bentley would get punished. And if I use that tone of voice, even now, to my dog Bentley, like his ears will droop, his head goes like, he's internalized.
Shame, right?
He's internalized like I've been a bad dog.
Right.
Now, I think the same thing kind of happens to us as human children, that in part of parents trying to protect us and raise us and help us learn not to poop in the house, things like that, we're told, like, bad kid, don't do that. What's wrong with you? And in an ideal world, we would grow into healthy relationships that teach us to distinguish. You're not a bad person.
Correct.
You're a good God-made person who sometimes does bad things.
Yeah. Right.
But most of us didn't have language for that.
Correct.
Let alone in ourselves, in our environments. So we can hold on to those ideas of, I'm a bad person, I do bad things, I'm dirty, I'm in the way, I'm unwanted. And maybe they were communicated to us even inadvertently as infants, as young children. Yes. And we just keep building on that structure because we don't have a perfect Christ-centered culture around us that teaches us to distinguish our identity and value from those bad things. And so we just have these patterns, and you can hear it in people's stories. And probably for those listening, if you've really worked on unpacking your story, and you say, where can you first identify feeling like I'm not good enough? And they'll go way back, and as they tell that story, it's like, was that the first time you think they felt that? It's like, well, probably not. It's just the first one I remember. And so we're carrying this message of, I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy, And it just becomes this elevator music in our soul saying, there's something wrong with me. And the beauty is when we address it, man, it can be a whole new tune that plays in our lives.
Yeah, and as adults get healthier, we know how to respond to peers as well as kids, grandkids, in a much healthier framework.
Yeah.
And I think that's just growth is in our humanity. I think, Nick, you remind me of that. I didn't poop inside the house as far as I know, but I did in my pants growing up learning.
Right. Yeah.
But I did have a time where my brother and I, we share the story, streaking up and down the neighborhood in the 70s as kids.
Yeah.
And that's the first time I can remember feeling shame. And good parents loved me, but it wasn't about training and guiding. It wasn't about saying nudity is okay here, but not here. Yeah. It was more of that, don't you do that, that's bad, that's wrong, that's evil, and trying to get that out of us. Yeah. But I think it gave a message that I didn't really need or know how to process in that regard.
And it's interesting, too, something that I've identified in my parenting is there are times when I have a big reaction that has far less to do with what was done and more of my fear that this may become a pattern.
Right.
Where, I've heard, I think it's Bob Vandermeer, one of our clinicians, talking about his son in the bath, or I've even experienced this with my sons, where like they'll play with their penis, and it's like, whoa, what do you do? Stop! Don't you know? Like, it's like he's 2 years old; he has no idea what he's doing.
Yeah, natural
like,
curiosity.
Don't overreact.
It's
don't
a
get
part
afraid.
of his body.
Yeah, don't get afraid of the pattern that may happen later. Like, be in the moment right now. And so, what's interesting though is that big reaction can reinforce shame. For my kids. And so I think it's something we have to be aware of too.
My daughter recently was doing the same thing, bathing our grandson, and said, oh, it looks like you discovered God gave you a toy on the outside. Just ha, 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 tongue in cheek, but really just not making such a big deal.
Totally.
But just, hey, God gave you nerve endings, and that's kind of how that is. And I think the more we are so reactionary, but move toward that educational base of appropriate, inappropriate.
Yeah.
But man, Bob hits it so right. I remember just my parenting, being afraid, that your kids are going to make wrong choices.